H.R. 5021, the Highway and Transportation Funding Act of 2014, extends federal surface transportation programs and ensures the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund through May of 2015. H.R. 5021 is a clean extension of the surface transportation programs and continues the MAP 21 reforms. We have an immediate critical need to address the solvency of the trust fund and extend the current surface transportation law. This bill does that in a responsible way, with policies that have all previously received strong bipartisan and bicameral support. If Congress fails to act, thousands of transportation projects and hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country will be at risk. This legislation provides much-needed certainty and stability for the states. This bill in no way precludes Congress from continuing to work on addressing a long-term funding solution and a long-term reauthorization bill, which remains a top priority for the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. However, this legislation is the responsible solution at this time, ensures that we don't play politics with these programs, enables us to continue making improvements to our surface transportation system. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, passage of this bill today is absolutely necessary to keep our surface transportation programs up and running. In less than a month, the Highway Trust Fund will go belly up and force feed our states ration payments for their transportation and infrastructure investments. This would starve our national economy, put states in a desperate situation, and cost jobs. Congress must act now to avert this unnecessary crisis. The bill under consideration today will help states get through the remainder of the construction season. It will also provide time for Congress to come together and pass a longer-term surface transportation law so that we don't find ourselves in this crisis mode again. But this needs to happen sooner rather than later. Because this bill leaves our highway transit and safety programs on autopilot, while the driverless car may be the way of the future, it's no way to run our transportation programs. And I know the chairman has driven those cars on autopilot. Passing extension after extension only brings us more of the same, and our states have already said that the status quo isn't meeting their needs. A long-term, robust surface transportation bill is the only way we're going to address our greatest infrastructure challenges. It's the only way we'll be able to build on what works and reform what isn't. And it's one of the few surefire ways to boost our economy, create jobs, and help us compete with our global rivals. Starving the beast simply doesn't work when it comes to transportation and infrastructure policy. We need greater investment in our roads and bridges. We need an increased focus on moving freight across our borders and overseas. Excuse me. We should grow regional collaborations to build significant projects, and we must bring every possible transportation job back to the U.S. to be done by American workers. It's worth noting that this debate is about far more than accounting, dollar signs, and trust funds. It's about the men and women who work in these industries and have to face needless uncertainty about their futures. It's about those who rely on public transit systems, and it's about the driving public who must endure aging infrastructure and the car repair bills and safety concerns that come with it. I'm going to vote for this bill today because it's the best solution. And not because it's the best solution, but because it does avert an immediate crisis and keeps the ball rolling forward. I thank the members of the Ways and Means Committee for their work on this bill, and I look forward to working with our chairman, Mr. Schuster, to bring forward a robust, long-term surface transportation bill to vote on in the near future, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from West Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now wish to yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Highways and Transit, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Petri.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The debate we're having today is not really about the future of the Highway Trust Fund. Fortunately, today is about doing what Congress does too often, kicking the can down the road, avoiding one crisis while setting up another. I recognize that more time is often needed to craft a more robust bipartisan solution, the result of which is often well worth the delay. But, Mr. Speaker, we must come to our senses. We must realize that another short-term patch is not really what our state governments are calling for. This is not really what the American Trucking Association or the Chamber of Commerce is calling for. For this and is not what the American people sent us here to accomplish. For close to 50 years, the Highway Trust Fund was self-sustaining. Those who used the roads paid for the roads. But we've been stalled in the 20th century. The fuel tax, which traditionally paid for highway improvements, hasn't been changed since 1993, while construction costs have grown more expensive, cars have become more fuel efficient or run on alternative fuels, and infrastructure needs have continued to rise. In the Highway and Transit Subcommittee, we've had hearing after hearing where state transportation officials, mayors, governors, truckers, transit operators, economists, and experts in transportation policy have testified with unwavering support for a long-term, fully funded surface transportation bill. And that should be our goal. But at the end of the day, we can't let the quest for the perfect stand in the way of the good or the acceptable. In this case, we have an obligation to keep our highway projects going, our transportation moving, and our economy growing. Since this is the only option we have today, this is what we will do. But we need to stop the patches and budget gimmicks and come up with a viable, real solution on how we fund the trust fund. History shows that it is hard to do before an election. Perhaps it will be easy to do after that. So I ask my colleagues to consider this question: which is the more responsible path? More budget gimmicks or raising revenue to actually pay for needed spending? Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Wisconsin yields back. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Speaker, I'm glad to yield at this point to the ranking member on our Highways and Transit Subcommittee, the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Eleanor Holmes Norton. 2 minutes.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my good friend from West Virginia for yielding, and I thank both the chairman and the ranking member for their hard work on this bill. I know that they would have wanted a long-term bill and that they have worked for a long-term bill. I appreciate that we have a bipartisan, bicameral bill, but I think that for all concerned, it expresses bipartisan disappointment. We had 2 years to do a bill since MAP 21, and all we've been able to produce is an 8-month stopgap fix. At the same time, the states and the localities we represent are probably grateful for small favors. The administration had already announced rationing with the insolvency of the trust fund as of August 1st, with only what little money would come in to replenish the trust fund for each state. We were staring an insolvent trust fund and a loss of the construction season in the face at the same time. That would have been an economic catastrophe with the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs. We must use this moment to face that we cannot rebuild our bridges, roads, and transit systems on pension smoothing stopgap extensions. The state backlog of projects will be left untouched by this bill because we have produced a climate of uncertainty. States won't dare start up the real work that needs to be done on their roads and bridges and transit because they are getting a patchwork bill. Patchwork bills yield patched up roads and bridges and deteriorating transit. At the very least, we owe it to the country to revisit this bill as soon as possible and as early as October. The delay in MAP 21 got us today's stopgap measure. Congress needs a spur under its saddle to avoid another delay. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, a state which, in a referendum, increased the user fee to fund the highway system in Arkansas. With that, I yield Mr. Crawford 2 minutes.
2 minutes is recognized for the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for his work on H.R. 5021, for which I rise in support. this afternoon, which provides greater certainty and sufficient funding for infrastructure projects across the nation. Without an immediate solution for the Highway Trust Fund's depletion, our state highway departments are left wondering if there will be adequate funds to continue any infrastructure improvement. In March of this year, the Arkansas Highway and Transportation Department warned that without congressional action to remedy the Highway Trust Fund shortfall, continuing with highway and infrastructure contracts that were scheduled for April letting would have threatened the ability to pay contractors. As a result, 10 vital projects totaling over $60 million were either put on hold or forced to find alternative methods of temporary financing. My colleagues have described similar scenarios in their own states, meaning that across the nation, new infrastructure projects have already ground to a halt, threatening general contractors, their employees, suppliers, and putting at risk the jobs that are both directly and indirectly supported by these projects. I think most lawmakers can agree that ensuring we have a reliable and modern infrastructure on land, water, rail, and air is critical. With the Senate announcing last week an agreement with Chairman Kemp and House leaders to enact a short-term funding solution, we can now turn our attention back to a multi-year transportation bill that will provide long-term assurance to states for financing infrastructure improvements. In moving forward with a long-term bill, we can spend time with stakeholders and constituents, the ultimate users of the infrastructure, and allow them to weigh in on what's being considered. As we return our focus to long-term legislation, we must also examine how to reform the Highway Trust Fund so that taxpayers will know how their dollars are being spent. With costs increasing and funds at a premium, we owe our constituents a more transparent system that demonstrates effective use of their money on infrastructure improvement. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting H.R. 5021, and I look forward to working on a long-term, comprehensive transportation bill to ensure our nation's future growth. We can't continue to beat the drum to attract businesses, add jobs, and improve the economy if we're not willing to use our authority to invest in our nation's infrastructure. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Speaker, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished lady from Texas, Miss Eddie Bernice Johnson.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Allow me to thank Chairman Mr. Schuster and Ranking Member Mr. Ray Hall and the Subcommittee Chair Mr. Petri and Ranking Member Eleanor Holmes Norton. I rise today in support of H.R. 5021, the Highway and Transportation Funding Act of 2014. In particular, the bill before the House this afternoon will do two things. First, it will provide a total of $35.3 billion for highway, public transit, and surface transportation programs. Secondly, it will extend service transportation programs authorized under MAP 21 through May 31st, 2014. I support this bill because it takes almost 60,000 construction jobs in Texas out of harm's way, and it ensures that over 3,500 active highway and transit projects in Texas will not be slowed or stopped by the Highway Trust Fund shortfall. However, my support for this bill is reluctant, as I believe we have missed another opportunity to craft a long-term highway program yet again. While I'm pleased that we have come together to address the impending highway crisis, we're also kicking the can down the road again. Today, 65% of our nation's roads are rated at less than good condition, and 25% of our bridges require significant repair. In Texas alone, we have over 300,000 miles of public roads, 8% of which are in poor condition. The measure before us today all but ensures that we will be having this exact same debate again sometime in the next Congress. Rather, what we need to do is adopt a long-term plan that will provide certainty, increase transit investments, and keep workers in our construction industries on the job. When we return from the August recess, I urge my colleagues to work together and begin crafting a long-term surface transportation bill. We have seen again and again legislating by crisis is not effective. As our roads, can I have 30 seconds? Thank
Gentleman
you.
is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. As our roads erode and our transit systems decay, we owe our constituents no less than acting in their best interest and enacting a long-term bill as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
LA yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield to one of the committee's true experts on infrastructure, small town mayor, small city mayor, construction business owner, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Barletta.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation that will keep our highway trust fund solvent until we agree on a long-term solution. If we fail to act, the money to fund surface transportation projects will soon run dry. That could result in a stoppage of more than 7,000 projects. We would lose countless jobs across the country and in my home state of Pennsylvania as well. I've always supported a highway bill of at least 5 years or more, but in the absence of one, I support this proposal to give us time to work out a longer-term funding solution. We need a plan that will meet our transportation needs while also providing contractors and builders the guidance they need to invest in equipment and employees. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this important piece of legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Speaker, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Janice Hahn, a very valued member of our Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Rahal for bringing this before us today. This short-term highway trust fund fix is crucial for keeping our highway and transit systems solvent, and I intend to vote for it. Letting the Highway Trust Fund become insolvent would be irresponsible and cut 700,000 jobs and increase congestion. But once our work is done here today, we do need a long-term creative solution to fund our much-needed transportation projects in this country. Over 64% of the roads in Los Angeles are in utter disrepair, costing each resident driver nearly $832 a year. My own dad, who was a county supervisor in Los Angeles for 40 years, used to offer people $1 for every pothole they could find in his district. If he made that offer today, he would go broke. And to fill this funding gap, I support looking at different ways of funding our roads in addition to the gas tax, such as vehicle miles traveled, which charges drivers by the miles that they travel. For our national economy, we need to focus on freight infrastructure. Freight bottlenecks cost us approximately $200 billion a year. And yesterday, I introduced the National Freight Network Trust Fund Act for a long-term fix that creates dedicated funding for our freight infrastructure. I urge all of my colleagues to support this short-term fix and join me in looking forward to solving this problem long-term. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady from California yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield to a gentleman from a state that's been one of the most innovative states in funding and moving projects forward at very fast pace. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Bouchon.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this legislation. Last year, I was honored to be a conferee for MAP 21, the highway bill, and I'm proud of the bill our conference committee produced and was subsequently signed into law. Our nation's transportation projects are being completed faster, and states like my home state of Indiana receive more federal funding than they had in the past. We do need a long-term solution to fund our infrastructure. Today, however, we need to support this extension. This funding is critical for projects such as Interstate 69, which runs through my district. With construction season underway, we need to ensure that every state can continue with the summer construction projects that are ongoing. This legislation is necessary to keep thousands of Americans working to rebuild our infrastructure, improving the flow of commerce, and ensuring the safety of Americans as they travel. I'd like to thank Chairman Camp and Chairman Schuster for their leadership, and I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to yield this time to a distinguished member of our Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the ranking member on the House Natural Resources Committee. To strike all that.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, then I'll continue where I was and yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, we can pretend that we care about the future of America and its transportation system. We used to be #1 in the world, widely recognized. We're now rated 26th, and we're moving down quickly. System's falling apart. 140,000 bridges need repair or replacement. 40% of the pavement on the national highway system has failed to the point where you have to dig it up, not just resurface it. And a $70 billion backlog in our transit systems, just to bring everything up to a state of good repair. That's not even to begin to think about building a 21st century transportation system to compete with the rest of the world. Chinese, 9% of GDP goes to transportation. They want to be able to move people and goods more efficiently and outcompete us. Even, Brazil, 6%. India, 6%. United States of America, 1%. Now, we've got to get serious about this. We're going to do a little shuffling around of some money and say, oh, we can pretend by pension smoothing and this and that we're creating money, so we get around we're not creating more debt or deficit here. Well, come on, really, it's pretty phony stuff. Let's get real about how we are going to fund our transportation future. Now, we're fighting with people who believe in a theory called devolution. That is, they want to devolve the duty of building a national transportation system to the 50 dispersed states and let them figure it out. Well, we tried that. This is 1956. Brand new Kansas Turnpike ended in Amos Schweitzer's farm field for years, because Oklahoma couldn't afford their part of that system until the Eisenhower bill passed it. We had a highway trust fund. Now, we know this works. User fee based, national system, coordinating among the states, not having roads that disconnect at the border, not tolling the heck out of everything, which some people would have us do, not fragmenting the system, not putting the burden. What are you going to say to the Port of Los Angeles, where 40% of the freight comes into the country? Oh, you figure out how to get the freight out of LA to serve the rest of the country, and you pay for it. No, this is a national obligation. It's international and national competitiveness. We have to get serious, and this bill here today is not serious or long-term.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield to a long-term member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, someone that fights every day for West Virginia, the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Capito.
Gentlelady from West Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member Rahal for bringing this bill to the floor today. More than 700,000 jobs and 6,000 projects and bridge projects could be in jeopardy if payments from the Federal Highway Trust Fund are delayed. I rise today in support of the Highway and Transportation Funding Act, which would prevent this catastrophic scenario. In my home state of West Virginia, more than 200 projects are currently receiving federal funding. If we fail to act now, we risk layoffs at the height of the summer construction season. Inaction would cripple the action of our state highway department to maintain our roads and bridges after a particularly harsh winter and build new projects like US 35 Quarter H and the King Cole Highway in West Virginia. American motorists, construction workers, and small businesses deserve certainty that the federal government will continue to invest in our nation's infrastructure. Today's bill provides that certainty for the remainder of this construction season, but I wait, as most of us do, to complete the work on the longer-term bill. I ask my colleagues to join me in passing the Highway and Transportation Funding Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to yield at this time to our distinguished Minority Whip, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, a strong supporter of our infrastructure in this country.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for how much time? Gentleman from West Virginia?
Oh, I thought he got such time as he wanted, but I'll yield 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for
No, those were the good old days. I tell my friend Mr. Rahal when I got an unlimited 1 minute. I rise. There's some good news, and the good news is that this committee is chaired by someone who wants to invest in America, grow jobs, and expand our economy. And I speak of my friend Bill Schuster, and I thank him for that. The other good news is that our ranking Democrat, Nick Joe Rahal, has a history of making sure that America invested in its infrastructure. The bad news is this bill does not give what Ms. Capito suggests it gives, and that is certainty. It gives a temporary, inadequate response to what is a long-term problem. I won't ask him the question, but I believe that Mr. Schuster absolutely agrees with me. We ought to find a fiscally sustainable funding source for our infrastructure and highway system. Mr. Speaker, well-maintained highway structure supports the growth of our economy and creation of good jobs. That's why I've been advocating for a long-term, sustainable fix that makes investments in our roads and bridges and provides certainty that needed repairs will be completed. And I'm for a big deal, not just certainty in infrastructure, but certainty in the investment in our economy. I will continue to advocate that. This bill, unfortunately, does not do that. It is better than doing nothing, but it does not do what we need to do. In fact, by implementing a short-term fix only until May, this bill promotes uncertainty for construction firms and other businesses that rely on projects paid for by the Highway Trust Fund, which supports American jobs. It also, Mr. Speaker, puts Congress in the position of having to deal with this issue next May, as next year's summer construction season is about to begin without any certainty of what we will do. Democrats would prefer to work with Republicans to pass a long-term fix now. Or, if we cannot do that, reauthorize it for a few months so that we can return to this issue after the November elections and pass a long-term fix. But we cannot take the risk of allowing this fund to run dry this summer. The Highway Trust Fund supports the infrastructure improvements that enable manufacturers to move their products to market faster and help attract businesses and jobs from overseas. It helps us to make it in America. Manufacture it, grow it, sell it here and around the world. If we allow it to go broke, our economy could lose as many as 700,000 jobs, according to the Department of Transportation. This bill, I think, will get some support, some significant support on our side of the aisle, but not because it is our choice, not because it is the right way to go. And in my view, as I said, I don't want to hurt him with his party or with anybody outside of this chamber, but I think Mr. Schuster agrees we need a long-term solution. So I urge my colleagues to work together in a bipartisan fashion to get a long-term, confidence-building resolution of this stop and jerk or go and jerk funding process that we are adopting. And I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do agree with the distinguished minority whip that we need a long-term solution to the trust fund and a long-term bill to provide certainty to this nation when it comes to our transportation system. And with that, I yield 1 minute to one of the newest members of the committee, but one of the hardest working members of the committee, Mr. Davis from Illinois.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Supporting H.R. 5021 means protecting hundreds of thousands of jobs throughout this great country. But more specifically, in Illinois, it means saving nearly 30,000 jobs and 4,000 construction projects that are already underway. Supporting this bill means improving our crumbling roads and bridges, a constitutional responsibility of this body. Supporting H.R. 5021 means governing responsibly instead of creating yet another manufactured crisis that would add even more uncertainty and instability to a still struggling economy. By extending this Highway Trust Fund, which is not my first choice, if we extend this bill and these programs through May, we can continue working on that long-term highway bill that both sides of the aisle stand here and say we need. And we can create jobs and keep up with our 21st century transportation needs. The Highway Trust Fund has fallen short for many years, and we need to come up with long-term solutions, and I look forward to working with my colleagues from the other side of the aisle and Chairman Schuster and his continued leadership. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I have a time check, please?
The gentleman from West Virginia has 1 minute remaining. The gentleman from Pennsylvania has 6 minutes remaining.
I'll continue to reserve my time then.
Gentleman from West Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure. Well, first, can I inquire as to how much time?
6 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished former chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Mr. Micah.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker and distinguished ranking member. Thank you for your hard work in trying to, right now, put a Band-Aid on our bleeding transportation funding. Thank you for trying to get the transportation cart out of the ditch. We have reached the 11th hour, and soon projects will be closing down across the country. It's unfortunate that we're at this juncture in the road to funding transportation responsibly. We had a chance for a 5-year bill, and we did not have the leadership, I believe, from the White House. In fact, President Obama was AWOL during that entire process. And now today we see the president, he's been at a bridge, he's going to be at another site, he's out at a research thing, talking about transportation funding. Where was the president when Mr. Oberstar, the distinguished gentleman who recently passed away, was chair of the committee, offered a bill, and he came and cut his legs out from underneath the Democrat chairman? We would have had a longer-term, fully funded bill. Where is the president? Well, whether it's to secure our borders, where has he been? He says he doesn't do photo ops. He's doing them now and will do them on transportation. He doesn't need to be at the bridge. He needs to be here working with these distinguished members of Congress for a long-term solution. He was absent at the border, and he's absent as we need to secure our nation's infrastructure. This is not acceptable, and I support this measure because it's an extension of what we did. It doesn't have deficit spending. It's responsible for paying for it, and it doesn't have earmarks. The last bill had 6,300 earmarks, not this bill. I support the measure.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from West Virginia
We
reserves.
have no more speakers on our side, so we'll continue to reserve. If the gentleman wants to close.
The gentleman from West Virginia.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Franco, a very distinguished member of our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Rahal. Mr. Speaker, transportation moves our economy, and modern infrastructure is a path to jobs and prosperity. So I will vote for this stopgap measure. But with that said, I want to echo my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who have called for a long-term sustainable fix of our highway trust fund so that the United States of America can compete in the world's market. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield the rest of my time.
Gentlelady reserves.
Mr. Rahal.
Gentlelady reserves the balance of time for Mr. Rahal. Mr. Rahal is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, much has been said today in dislike of this temporary fix, and I could not agree more. It's not my preference. We all want to address this in a long-term, robust manner, and that is also the opinion of the Transportation Trades Department, the AFL-CIO, who say that further delay will only maintain the status quo in keeping workers off the job, undercutting long-term planning, and hindering the country's advance to the 21st century transportation system. And a very similar view, like views expressed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce when they say in a letter to members of Congress, in the Chamber's view, the longer the patch, the easier it will be for Congress to kick the can down the road and avoid the tough question how we will maintain federal investment in highways, public transportation, and highway safety. I hope we come back before next May and address this issue. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized with 4 minutes to close.
How much time is left?
4 minutes.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first I want to start off by expressing my condolences to a former chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I guess back then it was Public Works and Transportation. Chairman Bob Rowe, who chaired the committee in the 80s, passed away this morning at 9:30 at the age of 90. And I just want to say that my thoughts and prayers are with his family at this time. I want to start in closing by thanking Chairman Camp and Ranking Member Levin and the entire Ways and Means Committee for passing out on a voice vote the 5021. I would like to reiterate that H.R. 5021 is a clean extension of the surface transportation programs that continues the MAP 21 reforms. This extension is necessary to provide much-needed certainty and stability for states while we continue to work on addressing a long-term funding solution and a long-term reauthorization bill. And I'm committed to that. I know that the Transportation Committee is going to work diligently on with the Ways and Committees of finding a long-term solution to the funding and also to passing a strong long-term reauthorization bill. Mr. Speaker, I encourage all members to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
At the end of this month, states across the country will be forced to put road constructions on hold if Congress cannot address the Highway Trust Fund. At risk are hundreds of thousands of jobs in the construction industry. A strong infrastructure is central to commerce, and at a time when millions of Americans are packing their bags to take a vacation or just traveling to work, we must ensure that projects can be completed so that the roads, bridges, and highways they travel on are modernized and safe. The bill before us today, H.R. 5021, will provide enough funding to get us through May 31, 2015, giving states the ability to complete projects. This bill is the only package with all provisions having a proven history of getting big bipartisan votes in both the House and the Senate. The three provisions, pension smoothing, custom user fees, and leaking underground storage tanks, have all been used previously in bills that received strong bipartisan votes. Pension smoothing and LUST were included in the last bipartisan Highway Trust Fund legislation. These are policies everyone is familiar with. They are policies that will provide the funding we need, and they are the only policies that will pass both the House and Senate in time to fund our highways after the end of this month. A long-term solution would be my preference, and an important feature of my tax reform discussion draft would provide enough revenue to maintain the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund for 8 years. In the meantime, I hope all members of Congress can work on a longer-term solution by the end of May next year. This won't be an easy task, so it's important that Congress has time to have a deliberative, open debate about bipartisan solutions rather than trying to hit Americans who are already paying more for gas with a gas tax hike. It's time to act now. State transportation departments have already started delaying or stopping certain highway projects to prepare for the fact that funding may fall short. Americans across the country deserve to see less gridlock on the roads and from their elected representatives. These policies are straightforward and have a history of bipartisan, bicameral support. I'm encouraged that the White House issued their support for the House Highway Bill, so we have an opportunity to solve this problem today. I would like to enter into the record the administration's statement of support. We also have strong industry support in a letter to Congress. I ask unanimous consent to enter a letter into the record. We also have strong industry support in a letter to Congress from 62 organizations, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, American Road and Transportation Builders Association, the American Trucking Association, and National Association of Manufacturers, which stated, and I quote, "A long-term federal commitment to prioritize and invest in our aging infrastructure and safety needs is essential to achieve this goal. Keeping the Highway Trust Fund solvent is the first step," end quote. I would like to enter into the record this statement of support and ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
A yes vote will avoid a last-minute crisis Would also, we would need to fund important highway projects and ensure that thousands of jobs are not at risk. I thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I shall.
Gentleman's recognized.
I will support this bill because we're at the 11th hour. No, it's not the 11th hour. It's a few minutes before midnight. Unless Congress acts by the end of this month, more than 100,000 transportation projects could be delayed, and as many as 700,000 jobs put at risk. But this legislation is a patch when what our nation's infrastructure needs is major repair. Doing nothing is not an option, but we should be doing much better. The Republicans, I must say, in this House talk a lot about the need for certainty, but they have riddled infrastructure funding with uncertainty. The fact that we're in this position illustrates just how little House Republicans have done since they assumed the majority in 2011 to address the long-term problems facing the trust fund and our infrastructure. Every Democrat on Ways and Means urged our chairman, Mr. Camp, to hold a series of hearings on long-term financing options for the trust fund. Yet the committee has not held a single hearing on this topic in the 3 years and 6 months that Republicans have been in the majority. And since 2011, the committee has had nearly 2 dozen hearings on repealing or dismantling ACA, and in the last 14 months, a half dozen hearings on the IRS. Those are not the priorities that are going to lead to a long-term solution of the trust fund. The nation, in a word, deserves better than this short shrift. It needs a long-term solution. Democrats on Ways and Means proposed an extension until December 31 in order to pressure a long-term solution this year. All of us on the Democratic side voted yes, and all the Republicans voted no. Let me end with a word on unemployment insurance. Senate Democrats and Republicans passed a bill to extend unemployment insurance that included an almost identical set of offsets as those included in today's legislation. The House Republicans refused to take up that measure, at the same time calling some of them the offsets pie in the sky in opposing the plan. Well, here we are today on the floor of the House, and 3 million Americans are still waiting for House Republicans to allow just one vote on a bipartisan plan to extend unemployment benefits. It's time that House Republicans get priorities straight. Mr. Speaker, I would now ask that the balance of my time now be given to a distinguished member of our committee who has worked so hard with the rest of us on highway issues, Mr. Blumenauer.
Without objection. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp's recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I'm pleased that Congress is finally acting today, not with a looming crisis, but one that is already upon us. This is entirely predictable. I've been arguing for months that Congress needs to act because the stopgap measure we did last Congress was designed to create precisely this Congress at precisely this time. 62 groups may have signed on a letter of support, but they prefer us to act meaningfully for long-term funding. They accept this because it's the only alternative to shutting down activities this summer. My Republican friends are unwilling, not unable, but unwilling to resolve the funding contradictions. Revenues have failed to keep pace with the demands of an aging, growing nation, making no change for 21 years as our infrastructure ages and falls apart. Our nation continues to grow and transportation patterns change. It's guaranteed that we should change as well. This Congress has refused to address its responsibilities. The House Ways and Means Committee has not had a single hearing on transportation finance. One of our most important responsibilities, uniquely ours, one that is unlike so many other items we deal with, it's possible to resolve. We haven't had a hearing in the 43 months that the Republicans have been in charge of Congress. Now, I understand there are conflicts within the Republican caucus. There are some that appear satisfied with locking us into a slow, steady decline called for in the Republican budget. No new projects until October of 2015, and a 30% reduction over the next decade, at exactly the time the federal partnership should be enhanced, not reduced. There are others in the Republicans whose answer is to just abandon ship, to give up on the federal partnership, slash the federal gas tax, and abandon any hope of a national transportation policy and partnership to help states with projects that are multi-state in nature or that need to be done when economic times are bad. That would be tragic and wrong to abandon the partnership that's made so much, but it's part of what's driving some of our Republican Tea Party friends. Just because they may not be a majority in the Republican ranks for either approach does not mean that we should continue to dither. Because Republicans' friends are unwilling or unable to resolve this, we have frozen the Transportation Committee in place. They don't have a bill. They're not going to have a bill unless we resolve what the budget number is. Increase, continue the downward slide, or abandon it altogether. We will be no better off next May to resolve this question. In fact, we will be worse off because we'll be in the middle of a presidential campaign with a new Congress, maybe new committee lineups. So as one of the stakeholders told me as we filed out of the hearing room last week, May 2015 is really May 2017, and I might add, at the earliest. We should reject this approach to hand off our responsibilities. We should resolve the resource question, and we should commit this Congress is not going to recess for August vacation, not going to recess to campaign in October, until we've worked to give the American people a transportation bill they need, deserve, to jumpstart the economy, create hundreds of thousands of family wage jobs, strengthen communities and families across the nation. American infrastructure used to be the best in the world and a point of pride, bringing Americans together. It's now a source of embarrassment and deep concerns. We fall further and further behind global leaders. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
In addition to the statement of administration position in support of the legislation, which has been entered into the record, as well as a letter from 62 organizations in support of the legislation, including the American Trucking Association, American Farm Bureau, National Association of Manufacturers. I also have a letter from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the world's largest business federation, which represents more than 3 million businesses of all sizes, sectors, and regions, is key voting this legislation and has written a separate letter in support of this bill. So I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the Chamber of Commerce letter regarding H.R. 5021.
Without objection.
Thank you. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I would recognize Mr. Pasquale of New Jersey, one of the champions in our committee for infrastructure in America.
For how long?
For 1.5 minutes.
Gentleman from is recognized.
I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank our chairman, our ranking member who was just here a few moments ago. It is ironic, as I said earlier today, when we take up the transportation and infrastructure legislation, that just a few hours ago, the champion of transportation and infrastructure passed away. He was the chairman of the Transportation Committee. At that time, it was the Public Works Committee. He left the Congress in '92. So it's ironic. And Mr. Chairman, you got it through the Speaker. You have to understand the frustration that exists on both sides of the aisle on this legislation. We know what's needed. We know what's going to happen by the end of August. Many projects throughout the United States of America are just shut down or begin to shut down. Bills will not be paid. That's not good. That's not acceptable. But on the other hand, when the dust settles, the very committee that we represent, where everything goes through, the Ways and Means Committee, will have voted for close to $1 trillion when the dust settles. Unpaid for, permanent tax cuts, many of which were never meant to be permanent. Check the record. So we can do this and add $1 trillion to the deficit, and we can't come up with a bipartisan 5-year, 6-year transportation plan for our roads. Wait till the bridges fall down. Then we'll do something about it.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Yield the gentleman another 15 seconds.
Gentleman's
I just want
recognized
to say,
for 15
Mr. Chairman,
seconds.
Mr. Speaker, that estimates as to how much we need to invest simply to maintain and repair our existing surface transportation system run as high as $177 billion per year. The actual capital spending in 2012 was only $103 billion a year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Schwartz, who's been a valued member of our committee, and we're going to miss her for 1.5 minutes.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our manufacturers, small business owners, and everyday commuters require a modern transportation system. Simply put, our daily lives, our safety, and our economy all require a first-rate transportation system. But our nation's infrastructure is crumbling, endangering travelers, lengthening commutes, and holding back economic growth. In their latest report card, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave my own home state's roads and transit a D-. Sadly, Pennsylvania has the largest number of crumbling bridges in our nation at over 5,000. This is simply unacceptable. With the Highway Trust Fund running out of funds, we must act to ensure that important projects continue, that workers stay on the job, and that we do not fall farther behind. But the bill before us is a temporary fix. Instead, this Congress should act on a robust transportation bill, not for a few months, but for years. A plan that will not only create jobs now, but will help ensure our economic competitiveness and economic growth locally and nationally for years to come. We should do our job and pass a fully funded 6-year federal transportation and infrastructure bill this year. Putting this off does not make it easier. It does not build a stronger economy. While necessary, this bill is another missed opportunity by House Republicans who are short on vision, too willing to rely on fiscal gimmicks, and unable to find common ground to get the bill done and done right. And I yield back.
Michigan.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as the remaining time?
The gentleman from Oregon has 5.25 minutes, and the gentleman from Michigan has 11 minutes.
You're reserving? Okay. Mr. Speaker, I would recognize for 1.5 minutes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, a valued member of our Ways and Means Committee.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. I had hoped that we would be here passing a long-term transportation plan. Unfortunately, that is not the case. However, I support H.R. 5021 as an initial step in strengthening the American infrastructure. This bill obviously provides immediate help to prevent default of the Highway Trust Fund and prevents impending delays in transportation. 30,000 people will continue to work in my state as a result of this bill and its passage. So I commend us for at least reaching this agreement, keeping things moving, and I urge passage and yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter from the Associated General Contractors of America in support of H.R. 5021 and urging its passage.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield at this moment 2 minutes to Mr. Doggett from Texas, an eloquent spokesperson for rebuilding and renewing America.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Today really demonstrates the House Republican fear of even trying.
Their guiding strategic principle in this Congress is to do nothing and be sure that no one else can do anything. And when they are eventually overwhelmed by a self-created crisis, as they have done with our transportation system, then to do next to nothing. Bridges can literally fall down, highways crumble, public transportation systems are hobbled, but House Republicans continue to reject a normal reauthorization of the Transportation Act of the type that for decades there was broad bipartisan support in this House. The only thing bipartisan about this last gasp, desperate effort to prevent a stoppage of transportation projects and the various groups that have endorsed it is that after having had presented as a purported serious proposal by House Republicans that the way to stop the traffic slowdown was to have a mail or postal slowdown to finance it, they see this as a chance finally to at least prevent temporarily a total shutdown of our transportation project system, and so they're going along with it. I'm not. I realize that to have a sound transportation system, you can't do it week to week or month to month. There has to be some long-term planning. These bridges cannot repair themselves. These potholes don't fill themselves. We often hear that freedom is not free. Well, neither are freeways. We have to have the revenue to have the kind of responsible national transportation system of the type that Dwight Eisenhower once provided the lead on when there was bipartisan support for reasonable public investment. Our competitors understand this. They're out there designing a 21st century transportation system that will be competitive, and we're being left in the potholes.
Gentleman's time has expired.
It's essential that we have a long-term bill, not this type of stopgap measure.
Gentleman
I yield
from
back.
Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
Does the gentleman reserve?
Then I'll yield myself the remainder of the time. I appreciate my friend from Michigan putting into the record what can only be regarded as reluctant letters of support. I wish that some of my colleagues would have had time to look at it. It's not a ringing endorsement of what is before us. It's a reluctant acknowledgement that that's all we have time for. That's all the Republicans will allow. I've worked with those groups, with the road builders, with the chamber, with the AFL-CIO, with the contractors, with elements large and small, local governments, transit. They are unanimous in their effort, in their regard, that we should deal with this in the big picture. A number of them had letters before the Ways and Means Committee that it should be done this year, not kicked forward. That's why I ask the Republicans to, in the person of our chairman, to allow us to hear from these people. If we would have heard from Pete Rioun from the road builders in person, Tom Donahue from the chamber, Rich Trumka from the AFL-CIO, Terrence O'Sullivan, the eloquent leader of the laborers, of the AAA and the truckers, Bill Graves, they wouldn't endorse this approach. They would be talking about our getting down to business. But the Republicans would not allow us a hearing, not for 43 months. So they're reduced to offering tepid letters of support so the whole system doesn't fall apart. Mr. Speaker, I'd respectfully suggest that those are not a reason to move forward with this legislation and be happy. It's a sad commentary that this is the best that the Republicans think they can give us. Those road groups who depend on moving freight, maintaining roads, who care about the health and well-being of our communities deserve better. Our families deserve better. The economy deserves better. I hope that we will, in a moment, have a motion to recommit that will shorten the amount of time that we let this Congress off the hook and make sure that we don't adjourn this Congress without doing our job.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume,
recognized.
and I yield to the distinguished gentleman from Alaska.
I thank the chairman for yielding Mr. Speaker, I'd like to go through history. The former chairman of the Infrastructure Committee and the last large highway bill, T-Lou, was passed. I had a dear friend named Jim Oberstar that served beside me and worked with me to write that piece of legislation and finally became the chairman. And what's impressive about that, this gentleman had more knowledge about transportation probably than anyone in this House has ever had, including myself. But I will tell you what was the biggest disappointment in his life is he wanted to write a transportation bill, a long-term transportation bill, and fund it. And guess who said no? Our president, Mr. Obama. His secretary, a dear friend of mine, came down and said, there's no way we're going to pass a long-term bill with full funding. Did not support Jim Oberstar. If they had done so, and even done what I wanted to do, is fully fund it, and I was opposed then by the seated President George W. Bush. If he was, in fact, Mr. Oberstar had the opportunity, with the Senate being in control of the President's party and the House being in control of the President's party, we would not be here today. We would have infrastructure bar none. We wouldn't be discussing what we're doing today. This measure today is a short-stop measure. But this Congress has to wake up, and the President should have woke up then when he had control to pass legislation for the infrastructure of this country. So when we get accused on this side of not doing anything and making a short-stop measure, go back through history, and this President has failed to recognize the importance. And for those interest groups, they should have been on him at that time and support Mr. Oberstar. So, Mr. Speaker, I say respectfully, this is a two-way street. That we have to understand this is a really important piece of legislation to keep us going, but then we have to solve it permanently, and let's be leaders, which we do not have down on Pennsylvania Avenue right now in infrastructure time. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
Well, thank you. And I would just add to those remarks by saying the Ways and Means Committee proposed a tax reform discussion draft that actually funded the Highway Trust Fund for 8 years. Now, my friends on the other side would like to shorten this temporary measure, which goes through the end of May, to just go through the end of December. And that's wrong for a couple of reasons. First, the Senate bill that's being considered has the same length of time as the current House bill. So that would be out of step with the direction that the Senate's trying to go. And we're obviously trying to form a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation here. And the second is that if we only were to pass this along for a few months, all of the problems that the members on the other side talked about would only be made worse, and that is there would not be the ability to plan over the winter, for example, for spring construction projects. And to just give a few months, again, makes it so temporary and so short that you would immediately have companies, states, employers hedging their bets on whether funding is going to continue after that time. So construction season isn't just in the good months of the year, it also goes through the winter, and that's why it's so important that we get through the end of May to June 1 to give the Congress time to really come up with a long-term solution, which clearly everyone prefers on both sides. And so with that, I urge support for the legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time pursuant to House Resolution, 669. The previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to provide an extension of federal aid highway safety, motor carrier safety, transit, and other programs funded out of the Highway Trust Fund and for other purposes.
For what purposes does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am in its current form.
The gentleman qualifies, and the clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon moves to recommit the bill H.R. 5021 to the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. At the end of Title I, add the following.
Gentlemen,
I would ask unanimous consent that we suspend the reading of the
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker,
Objection is heard.
I raise a point of order against the motion to recommit.
Does the gentleman reserve a point of order?
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. The clerk will read.
Subtitle E, Modification of Extension Period. Section 1401, Extension of Programs through December 31st, 2014. In this title, including the amendments made by this title, any reference to May 31st, 2015 shall be treated as a reference to December 31st, 2014. Add at the end of the bill the following. Title III, Sense of House of Representatives. Section 3001, Sense of House of Representatives regarding need to pass long-term transportation funding bill. A, findings. The House of Representatives finds the following. 1, the Highway Trust Fund is projected to become insolvent before the end of the fiscal year. 2, the user fee principle upon which the Highway Trust Fund was established is eroding. 3, since 2008, Congress has transferred $54 billion from the general fund to the Highway Trust Fund. 4, the primary funding mechanisms for the Highway Trust Fund have not been fundamentally addressed since 1993. 5, due to a decline in per capita miles driven, a decline in the purchasing power of highway excise taxes, and increased fuel efficiency, Highway Trust Fund revenues have not kept pace with the needs of United States infrastructure.
Pennsylvania.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Is there objection? No objection, so ordered. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This may be the last chance Congress has to honor our commitments to provide answers about transportation funding and develop a framework that will guide the federal partnership that's meant so much. The motion won't kill the bill, it won't delay the bill, it simply reduces the funding to the amount necessary for Congress to do its job before we adjourn for the year. It's not so that we cannot duck our responsibilities and hand this off not to the next Congress, but to the Congress after that. Make no mistake, in May of next year there will be no transportation bill, there will be no funding. Congress will be even more nervous and confused with the transportation problem that will be more complex. It will be more expensive, and the politics, I'm sad to say, will be harder, not easier. My good friend, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, does have a proposal. He's never had a hearing on it. And it was dismissed when it was announced by his own speaker, if I quote, blah, blah, blah. This is a sad moment for me, but it's not too late for us to do something about it. We need to move forward, have a tighter timetable. Let's finally have a hearing in Ways and Means. Let's have a proposal going forward. I'm perfectly willing to work in August to do this. I'd be happy for us to add days in September. We shouldn't recess in October to campaign and leave a big question mark. It's true that it takes time to put these things together, but we won't be putting it together next spring. Mark my words. The Republicans need to enable us to find out where they stand. Will they finally have a hearing on my friend Mr. Kemp's proposal? Will they slash the Highway Trust Fund and abandon the responsibilities? Or will they just use the Ryan budget and reduce transportation 30% over the next 10 years and no new projects for 15 months? Those are all legitimate issues. They deserve to have a day in court, and if we get down to work, we could resolve it. I'm confident we could do it. And it'll be just as easy, if not easier, to do now than waiting till next year when the clock will be ticking, when half the United States Senate will be running for president, and we'll have a new lineup. Other than the speaker, who may be happy to have avoided it, it's not going to be any easier. I respectfully suggest that we honor those 62 groups that want us to move. Look, they would much rather have us do it this year. We had infrastructure that was once the envy of the world. Now it's a source of embarrassment. We are 27th in the world and sinking. Our problems are getting more expensive. They're getting harder. I know how hard the job that the chair of the T&I committee has. I respect him. I respect the committee. But they need to know exactly how much money they've got so they can fashion a bill. And if they did that, they'd be able to crank one out, I'm confident, in a month or two. But right now, after an entire Congress, they don't have a bill. We don't have a bill. Those 62 groups and organizations don't have a path. What they have is a great big question mark next May when we start this all over again. This shouldn't be a partisan argument. I disagreed when President Bush shut it down. I disagreed that President Obama didn't move forward. But it's not Republicans versus Democrats. It's not House versus Senate. It's time for us to all come together and work as those stakeholders would have us do. In fact, we don't even have to have any courage. We can just follow what those experts who represent truckers and AAA and local government and contractors, what they have offered as guidance. Read the special commissions that have reported to President Bush. This is not rocket science. It's will, it's action, it's deciding exactly how much we're going to spend and when. Mr. Speaker, I would respectfully request that the House approve this motion to recommit, give us enough time and money to avoid the summer shutdown, but not enough to let this Congress off the hook and hand it off to the 115th or the 120th Congress. But we do our job so America can do its. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my point of order and seek time in opposition to the motion.
The reservation is withdrawn, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do rise in opposition to the motion to recommit. And I just want to say I have high regard and great respect for the gentleman from Oregon and his passion for infrastructure. As long as I've been here, he's certainly been a strong advocate. Leaving the committee to go to Ways and Means, I know his passion was on the the Transportation Committee, but now he's on a committee that certainly can help the process and move it forward. But I strongly oppose this motion to recommit. It shortens the length of the time of the extension, and I'm afraid that putting all your eggs in the lame duck basket will cause us great problems, and I don't believe it'll be successful. And then what do we do then? We're going to be doing another short term and another short term extension. So shortening the length is not appropriate, I believe. I think this is the best strategy. It cuts funding. I don't believe that that's in our interest. If we don't get this into next year, we're going to lose that funding because somebody will take it for something else. And if we're not successful in lame duck, then we're going to be going into the next construction season, and then we have trouble working out a solution to that when you cut the funding. It also increases taxes, and something right now I just don't believe this country can accept. We have immediate critical need to address the solvency of the trust fund and extend the surface transportation law so that we can get through this construction season and we can continue with the planning season to move us into next year. I'm confident that we're going to be able to do something next year because I believe we have to do something, not on just this issue, but on many issues that we've kicked the can down the road. And as the distinguished chairman of the former chairman of the Transportation Committee pointed out, my colleagues, not Mr. Blumenauer, but many of my colleagues on the other side, went and kicked the can down the road and passed a massive stimulus bill that did not put about 5 or 6 or 7% of that into highway funding when we all know that was where the need was. Former Chairman Oberstar wanted to do a bill, but again, his own party left him. His own party was irresponsible on that. And again, passing a stimulus bill, which I believe hasn't worked, and if it would have been directed to transportation, to infrastructure, we'd see a very, very different economy today. I also add that extending these programs through May in no way precludes Congress from continuing to work on addressing a long-term funding solution, which I believe we have to do. It no way precludes us from moving on a long-term reauthorization bill, which we continue to work on in the committee, which is a top priority for the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. However, I believe this legislation is the responsible solution at the time. It ensures we don't play politics with these programs. It enables us to continue to making improvements to our surface transportation system. So I strongly oppose this motion. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Oregon.
On that, I would ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of passage of the bill. This is a 15-minute vote. Yes. On this vote, the yeas are 193 and the nays are 227. The motion is not adopted. Question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, I would respectfully request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.